Good morning and welcome. I'm Karl Rethemeyer, Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences here at UMass Amherst. We began this panel with a heavy heart. For a week now, Ukraine has been under attack by the Russian Federation. I'm old enough to have passed through Checkpoint Charlie and into East Berlin in 1988, and then to have seen the world change a year later when the Berlin Wall fell, followed 2 years later by the transformation of the Soviet Union into constituent republics. As a newly minted college graduate in 1991, it seemed like the world had changed immeasurably and mostly for the good. And now it seems likely that at minimum, the European order that came into being after November 9th, 1989 has also passed away. But unlike 1989, we are witnesses to history in nearly real time, as told by the people who are living and experiencing it directly. Like Chancellor Subbaswamy, we join in condemning this unprovoked attack, as does the 5 colleges' Russia and Eurasia programs, who have posted their own statement. You may find a link to this statement in the Zoom window. Today's panel will try to help us grapple with what has happened, what is happening, and where this conflict may be going. The panel brings together 5 faculty members whose scholarly work and personal experiences have given them each a perspective on the war in Ukraine. I'll begin by introducing all 5. Each will then have about 5 minutes to provide remarks on the perspective on the conflict. We will field questions from our audience through the Q&A feature on Zoom, so please feel free to submit your questions through the webinar. We'll try to answer as many as possible in the time that we have. And here are our panelists. Audrey Altstadt is professor of history here at UMass Amherst. Dr. Alstedt is an expert on Soviet history and nationalities, especially Azerbaijan. She has consulted for Freedom House, Oxford Analytica, the US State Department, and the Commission for Security and Cooperation in Europe and other agencies. Ina Ganguli is Associate Professor of Economics. Her research areas are labor economics, the economics of science and innovation, international development, and economic history. In 2018, she received the Russian National Prize in Applied Economics for published research on the Russian economy. Dr. Ganguli completed a Fulbright in Ukraine in 2004, and her dissertation was on scientists and migration from Ukraine and Russia. Lauren McCarthy is Associate Professor of Legal Studies and Political Science and a research fellow at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Her research focuses on the relationship between law and society in Russia and human trafficking. She has lived and worked in Russia for over 20 years. Julie Hemment is chair of the Department of Anthropology. Dr. Hemment is an ethnographer who works in post-socialist Russia. Her research interests include gender, NGOs, and youth and civil society. She's written 2 books on Russia, and her most recent research and writing projects explore the topic of satire in US-Russia political communication. And Paul Musgrave is Assistant Professor of Political Science. He studies US foreign policy, international relations theory, and how oil revenues change political institutions. He's written for the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Slate, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and other outlets, in addition to his published academic work. Each member of the panel will speak in the order in which I just introduced them. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Altstadt.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Rethemeyer. It's a pleasure to be here with all of my colleagues. When Russian President Vladimir Putin voices his claims against Ukraine, he relies heavily on historical arguments. Let me select just 2 of several. According to Putin, Ukraine is Russia, and Ukrainians are Russians. They are not a separate people. Ukraine's history, especially the Kievan Rus state, is Russia's early history, including the baptism of Prince Vladimir, the Grand Prince of Kiev, in 988 AD. And this represents Russia's conversion and is part of Russia's rather than Ukraine's history. Now, how do we make sense of these various claims within historical context? I'm going to screen share here, and we'll look at a couple of slides, which I'm hoping will clarify some of these issues. The first slide, of course, is the one we've looked at often with Russian incursions. This demonstrates where Ukraine is with respect to Russia. You can see here the long border with Russia, Belarus, and then the various states to the west, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, etc. Around the year 1000 to 1100, this is a rough map of Kievan Rus. It appropriately has fuzzy borders because there's no way really to be confident about the precise definition of borders. But even if they're only approximately correct, they include today's Belarus and Western Russia. So maybe Putin's historical references actually have it backwards, and that really all this belongs to Ukraine. If we move ahead a little bit to the 13th century, this was the Mongol Empire. And as you can see, what is today Ukraine, much of Russia, Belarus, and other areas were part of the Mongol Empire. So maybe it really all belongs to Mongolia. And from 1600 to 1700, and 50 years or so, both before and after, all of this territory is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which, as you can see, is superimposed here on the borders of modern states. And so maybe the historical argument should really be that this actually belongs to Poland, or that it belongs to Lithuania. My point in all of this is that the use selectively of historical snapshots is misleading, that there's a difference between legitimate interpretation of history based on a variety of sources and understandings and historical manipulation. And Putin is in fact engaged in political manipulation in this instance. The Ukrainian national movement was consolidated and its views articulated about the middle of the 19th century. And it drew on this earlier history, particularly its beginnings with Kievan Rus and its subsequent contacts with European states, with Crimean Tatars, with Cossacks and other peoples. The Ukrainian identity in the 19th century was articulated in terms of this history and its mixing with a variety of peoples that did not touch Russia and Russians in the northeastern cities. This, Ukrainians argue, constitutes their distinctive identity. The Russian response to this movement, starting with Nicholas I, was to deny and to vilify those who constructed this history, such as the Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, and to arrest the poet Taras Shevchenko and forbade him to write. The Ukrainian language itself was banned in the Russian Empire. The ban on the Ukrainian language lasted until the 1920s, when it was legalized by the Bolsheviks. But their tolerance for the language and other languages of the peoples of the new Soviet Union was brief. Nationalism of all kinds threatened their new empire as it had threatened the empire of the Romanovs. By the late 1920s, the Soviet regime began to impose uniform content in literature and the arts. Cultural figures of Ukraine, like other nationalities, were exiled, many were executed. And the unique level of brutality of collectivization in Ukraine led some Ukrainian peasants to welcome the Germans in 1941. Nevertheless, many Ukrainians continued to fight with the Soviet army against Germany in World War II. On the eve of the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, ethnic Russian leaders worried, and we know this from an abundant set of records, worried very much about Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian independence, and the role that Ukraine might have in a post-Soviet world. The issues here are complex, and my colleagues will address many of these. There are many intermarriages between Russians and Ukrainians. The languages and cultures of Ukraine and Russia are close. There is a large Russian minority throughout Ukraine, but particularly concentrated near the eastern border. For Putin, the claim to protect these Russians or Russian speakers is tactical, but it is also an emotional and a psychological argument. To Putin and other Russian nationalists, the national consciousness of Ukrainians is an extreme form of nationalism. Nationalism always being a bad thing within the Soviet parlance, and it constitutes, Putin claims, Nazism that Putin must quash. Is this war about strategic issues, the strategic significance of Ukraine, its location, and the possibility of NATO in Russia's backyard? Yes, of course it is. It's about economic issues, and particularly natural gas sales and pipelines. Yes, it is. But Putin's treatment of Ukraine, from his rhetoric in 2014 to the present war, has an edge to it that other strategic and economic efforts do not have. And the reason is that the Ukrainian national identity pulls the rug from under a huge piece of Russian history and Russian identity, and that Putin cannot tolerate. I'd like to yield the floor now to my colleague, Ina Ganguli.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Altstadt. Thank you to Dean Rethemeyer. I'm going to share some slides. So as Dean Rethemeyer mentioned, I did a Fulbright year in Ukraine in 2004 to 2005, which happened to be the year of the first revolution, the Orange Revolution. And I just want to say a few things that are going to, really pick up on things that Professor Altstadt had mentioned, which is, about the complexity here in terms of the politics, the history, and Ukrainian identity. And so I wanted to kind of just, zoom out and kind of, mention kind of two important events that happened that you probably heard about in the news in the 2000s. So the first was the Orange Revolution, which I actually was able to be in Ukraine for. And then the second revolution, which is often called the Euromaidan or the Maidan Revolution. And both of these, what you'll see is kind of, these were outcomes of Ukraine kind of being, again, in a position where it's always this tug of war almost between Europe and, Russia. And the 2004 Orange Revolution began because you had Viktor Yanukovych, who was, the Russian-backed candidate, who was a candidate for president, and Viktor Yushchenko, who was, another candidate. And in the first round, in the runoff, there was kind of widespread, evidence of corruption and fraud. And so the people came out to protest. And, this is one image of those times, but it was, these really large protests. And I would say, I spent some time in Ukraine before this. I would say this was kind of the first time that people really felt, I'd say, free to come out and get in the streets. And what we're seeing right now in Russia, that, you don't have that freedom. But people were out there for, it was about a month and a half in cold temperatures. And the result was that there was a new election and Yanukovych, the Russian-backed, candidate, lost. Now, zoom forward past, a lot that happened in between to 2013, 2014, and actually Yanukovych is president. So that's a whole other story that we don't have time to get into. But Yanukovych is president, and there was going to be a signing of a European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement. So again, going closer to Europe, to the EU, and the Ukrainian government decided not to sign it. And this led to protests. And you can see here, just the scale of these protests were really large. And unfortunately, they actually led to violence. And eventually the outcome, though, was that Yanukovych was ousted and there was, the government was overthrown. Now you can see that, there's the common figure here is this man, Viktor Yanukovych, who again, was very close to Putin and the Russian Federation. He left, has been in exile in the Russian Federation since he was ousted. And, just I think it was yesterday, the news came out in Ukraine that he's waiting in Minsk to be, reinstated as a puppet president, depending on how things go. And you can imagine from my Ukrainian family and friends, I think this is, hearing this just kind of puts, fuel on the fire. That this is really going to get people even more upset with what's happening. Now, why I'm mentioning these things, that I think these two events really play into what, this idea about the complex Ukrainian identity and history. And as, Professor Alstedt was saying, there's a lot of complexity to the Ukrainian identity. Oftentimes it's simplified into language. And so here is a map of Ukraine, which shows kind of the primary, the majority speaking Ukrainian, which is, primarily in the West, and then the majority speaking Russian. And often it's easy to kind of, look at this and say, okay, the East is more, Russian speaking, they support Russia, the West, Ukraine, but it's much more complex than that. And here, this is the election results from 2010, where you have blue, which was Yanukovych when he became president, and then pink was Yulia Tymoshenko, who was kind of the main other candidate. And what you can see is it does kind of, split along, the East-West, but it's not so clear. You have Poltava, which is actually where I have family and friends from, which is kind of near in this place in the middle. And, there just I had my nephew sent me a picture of people signing up to volunteer for the Territorial Defense Unit in Poltava, and people were waiting for 8 hours to sign up to fight. And so I think the big, a lot of people are trying to think about what's happening in Putin's head right now, but a big miscalculation was that, people would not fight for Ukraine. But I think these two events, especially, but, kind of the last 20 years, people have been coming around this idea of a Ukrainian identity that's close, that's part of Europe, and people are willing to fight for it. I just wanted to say one other, a little bit about migration. That's my main, kind of area of specialty. Ukrainians, there's a large diaspora. A lot of people have emigrated already. But what you see is there's also a lot of people who were trained in the West who came back to Ukraine and were there and trying to really build these institutions to make Ukraine part of Europe and have those institutions be strong. This unfortunately is a picture of the university in Kharkiv, which is in eastern Ukraine. There's really a lot of destruction right now in terms of obviously the buildings, but also in terms of the talent. People are leaving the country, also from Russia. And what we know from research in these areas is that this is going to be devastating for Ukraine, obviously, but also for Russia. You have all these scientists, intellectuals who are leaving as the Iron Curtain is kind of coming down again. And so what the West is going to do in terms of supporting these scientists is going to be really important going forward. And unfortunately for Russia, this can only, among all the other devastating things that are going to be happening, this is again going to be another big blow to Russia going forward. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lauren McCarthy next. Thank you.
So thank you very much to everybody. I'm also going to share my screen here. It falls to me the somewhat unenviable task of talking about the actual war and what's been happening in Ukraine. And so I want to do that with the map on the screen so that it's clear sort of where we stand now. As many of you know, on February 24th, Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation to stop the, quote, genocide against the people of the Donbass, these areas labeled currently Lugansk and Donetsk. In that speech, he said he didn't plan to occupy Ukraine, but that his goals were to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Within the hour, Russian shelling began and troops began to move in from Russia and Belarus, where they'd been stationed for several months already in a show of force to the West. When it first started, I thought, okay, these goals are sufficiently vague that they can either lead to a total takeover of Ukraine and a removal of the current Ukrainian government, or at some point, the Russian state can say, okay, we've sufficiently denazified and sufficiently demilitarized the situation such that we can go home. But it quickly became clear that it was the former that was the war aim rather than the latter. Russia had hoped for a quick blitzkrieg attack to lead to mass surrender and without very much casualty for either side. And severely underestimated the willingness of the Ukrainian people to fight. And I think that was made the most clear when, on the second day of the war, Putin made a speech to the Ukrainian military, who had been fiercely resisting the Russian incursion for well over 24 hours at that point, and called on the Ukrainian army to, in fact, turn around and overthrow their own government and put down their weapons. And that showed a real disassociation with what was actually happening on the ground. It wasn't long before Russian military started to strike civilian targets, which they've continued to do very aggressively as the days have passed. In cities around Ukraine, as Ina showed, there have been major strikes on a lot of non-military infrastructure, including apartments, schools, hospitals, universities, government buildings, the Kiev TV tower, and most dramatically, the Holocaust Memorial in Babin Yar, which commemorates the place where over 33,000 Ukrainian Jews were slaughtered by Nazis during World War II. So to me, this military strategy is very reminiscent of the strategy that Vladimir Putin took when he first became the prime minister and then president in 1999 against Chechnya, which to me is very alarming. The goal of this kind of warfare is to intimidate civilian populations into surrender through terror, and the terror of not knowing when and if bombs will fall, encircle their cities, put them under siege, and as the Pentagon is currently describing it, slowly annihilate the military and civilian population. As of March 1st, the UN has already confirmed 752 civilian casualties, and the chances are very good that that number will rise. Ukraine is reporting significantly more. On the Ukrainian side, the military has put up a fierce fight, as has the civilian population, many of who have been training for months in civilian defense units, learning how to use guns and defend their city. And these are ordinary people. They're bankers, they're teachers, they're, metal workers in factories. Though the Ukrainian military is now getting significant shipments of weapons from the West and Europe, they're massively outmanned and outgunned by the Russian military, which is one of the largest in the world. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has shown tremendous resolve, courage, and leadership on the national and international stage. I'm sure many of you have heard parts of his speeches or in full. And for the first 7 days of the war, the Ukrainian military held Russian forces out of all major Ukrainian cities. Those smaller cities have been occupied by Russian troops or under siege, and Russian forces have continued shelling everywhere. So a couple things to point out on this map. While we've been concentrating a lot on what will happen in Kiev, the capital city, where Russian troops are clearly advancing from several directions, and we've heard about this 40-mile long convoy of Russian military vehicles to surround the city, Russian troops have also been making major advances in the south of Russia along the southern coast. So the first major Ukrainian city to fall to Russian troops was actually Kherson, which is down in the southern part of Ukraine. Mariupol is surrounded and has just undergone 26 straight hours of shelling, and electricity and water have all been cut off to the residents. They're under siege. There's speculation that Russian troop movement along the Black and Azov seas are meant to create a land bridge from Crimea to Russia. You can see that that doesn't exist with previous Ukrainian territory, and or to eliminate Ukraine's sea access entirely. Many towns and cities, the second biggest city in Ukraine, Kharkiv, has come under fierce shelling, and Russian troops are in the process of trying to surround that as well. So in this context, this sort of success, the David story and the David Goliath story has come with an incredible cost to Ukraine. Sources estimate that 1,500 to 2,000 troops have been killed as of 3 days ago in Ukraine. And this is probably an underestimate. Ukrainian troops have preemptively destroyed bridges and other infrastructure to stop Russian advances. Many towns and cities have been destroyed as Russian and Ukrainian troops fight back and forth over them. Ordinary Ukrainians in large cities are sheltering in subways, basements, and bomb shelters that are left over from Soviet days. More than 1 million people have fled Ukraine into neighboring countries as refugees, mostly women and children. And they're expecting that up to 4 million may also leave. There are also hundreds of thousands of IDPs, internally displaced people within Ukraine. So this level of destruction of infrastructure, let alone the loss of human life and the trauma of living through a war, is going to take a very, very long time to rebuild and recover from. And so I know that I'm getting close to the end of my time here, but what I'd also like to do is just say a little bit about who's fighting this war. We've talked a little bit about the Ukrainian military. It's a volunteer professional military. It's battle trained. It's been fighting in Eastern Ukraine for 8 years. It has a lot of combat experience. In addition, as Ina mentioned, the waits to enlist in the Ukrainian army are insane. More than 80,000 Ukrainians have come home to Ukraine to fight in the war. Beer factories and ordinary citizens are learning how to make Molotov cocktails in case things devolve into urban warfare. On the other side, the Russian military is made up of conscript soldiers primarily. Every Russian man who reaches the age of 18 owes 1.5 years of military service to the state. And we've heard consequently reports of increasing demoralization of troops, lack of food, lack of heat. Don't forget they've been sitting on the Ukrainian border for quite some time already. And the dissonance that they're feeling of fighting people who look like their grandmothers or who speak the same language as they do. The Russian Ministry of Defense has admitted to 500 casualties so far, and it took them about 6 days to admit to any. And yet the defense ministry in Ukraine claims about 9,000 Russian casualties. The reality is probably somewhere in between. And I want to highlight one moment of humanity that I think really displays the sort of ongoing Ukrainian war effort. Russian Ministry of Defense officials have communicated absolutely nothing to Russian families whose brothers, sons, grandsons are fighting, husbands are fighting in Ukraine, and they've become desperate to know. Ukraine set up a hotline, a Telegram channel, and website on which they've displayed information about soldiers that they've captured, soldiers who've been killed. They put their documents up there so that so Russian families can find out what's happened to their loved ones. And I think that's sort of one of the examples of the displays of humanity that sets the Ukrainian military apart from what the Russian military has been engaged in thus far. And so I just want to finish up by saying that I think the great irony of Putin's attempts to save, in quotes, the Ukrainians is that he has lost Ukraine to Russian influence forever. Ukrainians are united, they're proud of their nation, they're willing to fight for it. Poll from March 1st showed that 86% of Ukrainians now support EU membership. That's up 20% from before the war, and 76% support NATO membership, which is up 20% from before the war. The EU has also accepted Ukraine's application to start the process for joining. 88% of Ukrainians believe the Ukrainian army will win against all odds, and 93% of them are united behind the leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky. So it's been, there's a lot going on. It's a fast moving situation. And I hope that's been able to sort of sum it up, even though I probably went a little longer than I should have. So for more about how the war is affecting Russia, I'll turn it over to Julie Hemment.
Thank you so much to all of my fellow panelists. Thank you, Dean Rethemeyer, so much for organizing this important event. My remarks will really directly lead from Lawrence. Just by way of introduction, I'm an ethnographer of Russia, and I've worked on topics of protest and social movements over the last years. But before I move into my presentation, which is focusing on how people are responding to this in Russia, I just want to say, express how my heart is broken about this conflict that's playing out, and I recognize that many members of our community have loved ones in Ukraine, family members, friends, and I just want to acknowledge that. So thank you for this opportunity to come together and be in community as we consider this topic. So my focus today, I want to focus on the question of how people are responding in Russia, very much picking up with from the story that Lauren shared with us, and to share a little bit about the forms of resistance that are taking place and manifest, what they look like, and also what constraints they face, what are the constraints for enacting forms of resistance in Russia at the moment to this war, and also their prospects, how they might develop and unfold as time goes on. And I am going to share my screen to share a few slides with you also. First, I want to say that when the war broke out on February 24th, it was immediately greeted with forms of mass protest on the streets. To pick up from one of the threads that Lauren shared with us, this invasion, this aggression, this war against Ukraine was something that took the Russian population, Russian people, as much as ourselves, by surprise. Strikingly, the Russian state media, now we know about Russia that there's been, and from the historical context that's been shared with you today by my colleague, we know that there's a long history here, a recent history since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, And we know that there has been, so this war has been ongoing. And there's also been an information war that's accompanied that from Russia. So Russian state television since 2014 has delivered a narrative of hostility about Ukraine and about its its purported affiliations with the far right and the role of far right parties in Ukraine. So there has been an information war that's in motion, media campaigns to discredit the independence and nationalist movements in Ukraine. But that fact notwithstanding, there was no preparation for this armed conflict, this aggression that Lawrence just shared and laid out with you. The Russian state media did not prepare the population for anything of this order. And the radical shift in rhetoric and invocations of denazification and reference to genocide undertaken in Ukraine, this language was a shift. And as Lauren mentioned, there was a sort of vagueness to what the content of that would be. So this was something that left most people, I think it's fair to say, in Russia, took them by surprise. Equally, there was no preparation for the armed forces for the kind of operations that they may engage in. So to me, this was, when people talk about Russia under Putin, typically we recognize that the state, the population, often it's said that the population is somewhat split between those who watch the state TV, state-controlled narratives, and go to the state-controlled TV news programs for their news, and those who go to social media and independent forms of media, as if there's this divide, right, of the two Russias. Now, what's striking to me, what I just want to share at the outset, is that the shock was across both of these domains. I think it was fairly widespread. Now, the people that I am in dialogue with, and for a long time I've been doing research in Russia, as I've mentioned, the kinds of people that I'm in community with, scholars, colleagues, their expression was immediately one of shock, not only shock, but deep shame, and very swiftly expressions of how this was not a war that they were in support of, that this was Putin's war and not Russia's war. I had friends using this metaphor of being hostages, feeling as if they were hostages in their own country. So that's the sort of little bit of backdrop to what propelled these kinds of mobilizations. Now, the image I'm sharing with you is of a mass, kind of a relatively large protest, a street-based protest that took place in St. Petersburg immediately after the war broke out. You'll see that there's a high proportion of young people there. So street gatherings of this type are extremely rare now in Russia and extremely risky because of the response that they meet by the authorities. Very swiftly, as I'm sure you're familiar with images such as these as well, these manifestations of protest, of anti-war sentiment were clamped down on by the police. We've seen images like this, very immediate and sort of violent forms of repression. I want to share with you that this, the latest data I've seen over the last week since the war broke out, according to the last data I've seen, 7,500 people have been detained as a result of their protest action, their anti-war protest action, in over 100 cities and towns across Russia. I want to express here that the conditions to do this, to mobilize, to get out on the streets like this, are extremely challenging. Over the last 10 years in Russia, rights of assembly and expression have been radically curtailed. And last spring, in fact, there was a most recent crackdown, a major crackdown in response to protest mobilizations, people who came out in the streets in support of the anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny, as you may know. So in response to these very repressive moves, the consequences for doing this form of street protest are severe. Currently, the criminal code article on treason is invoked. So protesters such as the ones we see here, people who go out on the streets who are detained, run the risk of 20 years jail time. So protesters know this. and have been coming out all the same. This accounts for the fact that, there've been discussions in the media about why are the protests not more robust, more numerous. That, I think, communicates some of that. I also wanted to address particularly student activists. You may be wondering, this is a campus that's got a rich history of mobilization and engagement in protest actions. So what about the position from a student's point of view? I can share that youth have been very active in these street protests, but again, there are many, many challenges to them. Students in universities and in schools are being discouraged by the university authorities or school authorities from engaging in anti-protest action, and with consequences threatened them. The other image I want to share is of another form of protest that has been manifest, the single picket. These are forms of protest that were, until recently, the only form that was more or less possible within the constraints of the law, standing an individual holding up a protest sign or holding up some symbol. This particular single picketer, this was an image that struck me early after the war broke out. A picketer holding up a painting that will be well known to Russian audiences, The Apotheosis of War by the 19th century Russian artist Vasily Vereshchagin. This painting depicts a pile of skulls, as you may be able to see. Vereshchagin dedicated this work to all great conquerors, past, present, and to come. So clearly a very eloquent form of protest statement, anti-war statement there. So the fact that we see people on the streets is striking. In recent years, particularly since the last 10 years, but since in the last course of the last year, we've seen protest go into the digital domain, right? It's been very difficult, very risky to express opposition to the Putin administration, to Kremlin policies writ large. And so we've seen instead a proliferation of digital activism and complicated spatial tactics, artistic forms of protest. But people are coming out, these fears notwithstanding, these risks notwithstanding. I want to share another few, some other modes of protest or of resistance activism that I've seen, and via social media, some of the forms of social mediated digital activism that I've seen. These range from petitions that circulate, even as citizens, especially state employees, such as teachers, doctors, etc., are urged not to participate in anti-war demonstrations. There's a real squeeze on people, but they are writing petitions and circulating these, diverse citizens from diverse professional societies, for example. But this image that I'm sharing here is a social mediated project that I found to be quite powerful by an independent media outlet, journal, newsletter called Doxa. And it's a little resource book for those of tools and narrative strategies for people to engage with their loved ones, family members, or co-workers about the issue of the war, ways to advance an anti-war. So here you have a depiction of an anti-war protester activist in dialogue with someone who might have a different view of the war. So these kinds of tactics, ways to talk about people, ways to engage them and seek to change their minds. Feminist mobilization, feminist solidarity project, this feminist anti-war resistance movement. This is another of the forms that I've seen circulating. And finally, this very creative form of protest as it becomes harder to articulate resistance to this this war, a restaurant review. So this is a mode of protest whereby people, and I've got a quote here, this is thanks to Lauren for sharing this one with me, this sort of digital form of activism where people are going and in writing restaurant reviews and slipping in some of the information about what's taking place in Ukraine, slipping in information about the damage, about the war that's being prosecuted. Because another form of constraint that's being exercised here is the media blockade. The media blockade and the constraint on what is allowed to be talked about. In Russia, currently, there's a prohibition of referring to this operation as a war. So there are real constraints on what people are allowed to talk about and the dialogues that they're able to have. So to conclude, I just want to share a few thoughts about the prospects for these forms of resistance. Where might this go? What directions might this take? What hope do we have of these gaining traction and making an impact? And to pick up again on something that Lauren was addressed, the question of the casualties of war, the losses, the Russian casualties. This should the war losses, should this break, and again, social media activism, forms of social media activism, such as this one, such as the project in Ukraine, such as another one, many other projects that are seeking to communicate to Russian publics what is taking place, what the Putin administration is prosecuting, and to show the devastation that's being wreaked. That should these initiatives be successful, should this break through, then this could have an impact and hopefully will result in changing hearts and minds in Russia. I think the people that I'm in dialogue with, I think broadly there was a sort of response of shock, unpreparedness, horror. Ukraine, as we've heard, the deep cultural ties and the complex relations. Many people in Russia have friends, family ties with Ukraine. So these are all some of the factors that make this supremely important and make these solidarity projects, these attempts to connect with, to make people aware of what's going on, so very important. And I think I've probably spoken over time. I'm going to end here, but I want to share that there is a protest action taking place in Amherst, organized by members of the UMass community, 4 to 6 p.m. on the Amherst Common, an anti-war protest in solidarity with Ukraine to protest this aggression. Thank you.
All right, I believe that I am up next, and assuming that everybody can hear me, I've actually gone ahead and prepared some additional remarks. They are on the internet, and I'm dropping the link in the chat. And I also have, as everybody else has had, I believe, some slides to share. So I'm going to share those slides now. So the title of my talk is Peace Without Victory, and I'd like to speak about where we are in terms of the international relations of the moment and where we could be going. This is not going to be a talk that is particularly long on moral sentiment. The bravery of the Ukrainian people, the bravery of President Zelensky and others are remarkable and inspiring. But we are talking about something in which there is a clash of purposive, strategic actors. And even if it's tempting to denigrate somebody, even as unpleasant a person as Vladimir Putin, as being somehow crazy or otherwise unable to pursue goals rationally, I don't think that's the case. And I think that there is a way in which we should be thinking about an analysis of how folks are pursuing their agendas, even as the guns are firing. So one question that I have is simply, why are we here? A couple of weeks ago, certainly 3 weeks ago, if you'll remember, there was extensive debate over whether there would be a conflict in Ukraine to begin with. Certainly the Russian Federation denied it. A lot of very well-meaning people in the West and elsewhere thought that it was impossible. And not a few folks believe that the United States was spreading disinformation by revealing what turned out to be not only accurate, but extremely accurate information about Russian preparations and intentions. So there are different theories that have circulated about why Vladimir Putin has engaged Russia in an invasion of Ukraine. Among them, his argument is that this has to do with security threats, that the expansion of NATO and of Western influence into Ukraine posed a security threat. Other folks have argued that high oil and natural gas prices have given Putin the wherewithal to carry out an aggressive foreign policy. Still, other folks have focused on Putin's own state of mind. He's engaged in some bizarre public behaviors, like those incredibly long tables at which he meets foreign emissaries and even members of his own government. And finally, there are people who have pointed to the question of whether Putin himself feels insecure against threats to his rule. And I don't think that this is paranoia in the clinical sense, because sometimes even the paranoid have enemies. And it's possible that Putin sincerely believes that either the West or some internal enemies have boxed him into a corner into which war is the answer. Now, of course, we can't know the answer to these questions because we don't have access to Putin, but we do know the behavior that Russia has undertaken. And from my read of the situation, some combination of a belief about security threats, but also principally threats to Putin's own regime, his survival in office, and therefore his physical survival, are animating what he's doing. One of the big surprises to date has been that Russia has displayed extraordinarily poor military performance so far. This is both a question of simple military competence in terms of supplying its troops with food and fuel. It's also been a question, however, of a different set of tactics. I think Professor McCarthy is right to think about this as a parallel to the Russian invasions and pacifications of Grozny and Chechnya in 1993, 94, 1999, 2000. But one of the things that until the past several hours has not taken place is that the targets had been relatively precisely taken. We have not seen completely indiscriminate shelling of cities yet, although that may, as I'll explain in a couple of moments, change. One thing that Putin has managed to completely undo is any hope of dividing the Western alliance. Europe is solidified, NATO is solidified. The divisions between the Western allies that were pronounced before the war have largely gone away. In fact, Germany has embarked on something of a generational revolution in its foreign policy in terms of trying to secure energy independence from Russia, in terms of playing a larger role as a military power, and in terms of buttressing the West against Russian influence, which is a complete volte-face from where it was just a few weeks ago. And of course, Russia's aims, if it wanted to have some form of economic gains, have been undone because Russia today is economically isolated. Its fortress balance sheet of its central bank is under threat. Its currency is collapsing, and it looks to be in a long form of political and social isolation. To date, the West has responded with massive economic sanctions, which have caused all of those. You can see the value of the ruble has collapsed. This has made everything imported in Russia, including electronics and medicines, far more expensive overnight. It has hurt ordinary people tremendously. That is, of course, the goal of sanctions, to hurt a country. They are not a violent tactic, but they are coercive ones. Those Western institutions have been solidified in ways that it's difficult to express if you weren't paying attention to the European Union or NATO even a few weeks ago. The West has led an effort in the UN General Assembly, along with members of the Global South, perhaps most impressively the Kenyan representative, in order to condemn the aggression. Massive arms transfers have taken place, and there's even been some, although far from enough, attention paid to humanitarian and long-term recovery for Ukraine. But that's not to say that what is happening right now is going to be enough on its own to force the Putin government to change its course. The Putin regime probably mispriced how extensive these sanctions would be, but they certainly priced in some degree of a Western response. And even though it's likely that the poor battlefield performance of Russian troops to date has allowed the West to double down on solidarity and to take more aggressive economic measures than they otherwise would have, that's not to say that the purpose of sanctions right now is to completely counteract what's happening on the battlefield, nor is it likely that sanctions by themselves will be able to reverse what has happened on the battlefield, nor what is likely to happen over the next several days or weeks as Russian forces regroup, rearm, and resume their offensive, and likely escalate their offensive. For Putin, all of this poses a dilemma. Humiliation and defeat are unacceptable. For Putin, the stakes that he's playing with are not just Russia's national interest, not just its self-image, not just its status as a world power, but if he is humiliated, then he may well lose his office, and if that happens, there is some chance he will also lose his life. Humiliation and defeat are something that he will try very hard to avoid. That doesn't mean necessarily that he will have to win in the eyes of neutral observers, merely that he will have to come up with a way that is face-saving for him if he wants to end these hostilities. But actual victory may be too costly, and the purpose of the West sanctions and its arms transfers are in fact to make victory as costly as possible. What that suggests to me is that we're likely going to see an escalation of violence in Ukraine by Russian forces and of severe repression at home. The termination of Echo Moskvy and TV Rain in Russia suggests that political freedoms have been severely curtailed in Russia and that this is likely to continue and even accelerate. But the more Russia doubles down on its course in Ukraine, the longer term its pain and problems will be. But the problem is that there's also a dilemma for the West. An outright victory for the West would be only possible through humiliating Russia, again on terms impossible for Putin to accept. And so that is an outcome that he will do everything possible to avoid. And furthermore, the West in the long term does need Russia. The West is going to start feeling economic pain soon as well. Russia is a major part of the world economy. It is a significant exporter of food. It is obviously the energy supplier for Europe. Someone in the chat has asked whether the United States has an interest in Russian energy. It is Europe that depends on Russian natural gas. Any attempt to curtail Russian energy exports will lead to significant pain for the advanced industrial economies. That may be something that they're worth paying. That may be a burden that they're willing to bear, but we should not think that this is just something where the West has the ability to turn Russia's economy on and off like a light switch. On everything from titanium to natural gas to wheat, Russia has the ability to severely harm the rest of the world's economy as well. The balance of power is probably still in favor of the West, but we shouldn't ignore this balance altogether. There's also something in the way the West has responded with extraordinary moral condemnation of Russia's actions. That moral condemnation is deserved. This was an unprovoked attack by a sovereign nation on another sovereign nation with no justification. It is an assault of the strong against the weak in order to destroy the weak. Saying that this is an assault on democracy itself, I would qualify that a little bit. It is an assault on sovereignty and the independence of countries. But democratically, Ukraine is not necessarily without flaws. To hold it up as an exemplar is to excuse things that even Ukrainians would have admitted are real problems in their country's regime. Using the VDEM index of a country's electoral democracy, how well its democracy works, Ukraine is indeed a semi-democratic state, but it's one that has had problems. Nevertheless, it's also clear that what Putin has decided to attack is Ukraine's democratic and sovereign ability to choose its own path in foreign policy. And efforts to make Ukraine neutral would be to deny that sovereignty as well. And Putin's claim that he wants to pursue the denazification of the country are likely tantamount to an announcement that if he is successful, he will have President Zelensky and at least the top echelon of Ukrainian government officials killed. These are real stakes for the people involved. For the West, again, the problem is that a humiliated Russia would be one even more dangerous. There's also the obvious problems that if the West directly intervenes militarily, it runs the prospect of far greater escalation. Russia, as an integrated part of the global economy, cannot be indefinitely excised from the global economy. Not only would that eventually cause untold suffering for Russia's people, but it would also begin to undermine the prospect of having a long-term global settlement that is lasting. So complete isolation is impossible. It cannot be continued forever. And that means that even as Russia has begun to escalate its commission of what are likely war crimes, it is time to be considering how this ends and under what terms, even if we're talking months in advance, the sanctions regime can begin gradually to be unwound. A way forward in Ukraine can begin to be found, and one that allows all parties to walk away feeling like they can at least accept, even if they protest, the settlement is something that needs to begin to be thought of. And of course, all of this is done in the shadow of the fact that Russia has brandished its nuclear capability in a frankly bizarre and irresponsible way, but also a way that suggests that it is, however dimly, possible and credible that direct NATO intervention, even countries like Poland that are as sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause as is possible to be, have shied away from doing things like providing Ukraine with high-end equipment like fighter aircraft because they do not want to see the conflict escalate. So this will be a managed, ultimately likely morally unsatisfying conflict, and one that I think we can best describe in the terms that Woodrow Wilson used in January 1917 of a peace without victory. Because victory would mean imposing a peace, it would require humiliation, and it would require forcing Russia to accept terms that it cannot accept, and therefore forcing it to think about the use of even more unthinkable strategies. So right now, we have some very unpleasant but necessary factors that this analysis points to about what the West should be doing, maintaining solidarity, continuing to assist Ukraine, but also realizing that escalation is dangerous and unpalatable. And I believe it is more important than ever to begin planning for the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, both civilian and militarily, and also to not make judgments or pronouncements like the idea that our goal as the West is the regime overthrow of Russia. That is something that would make almost any settlement impossible to achieve and would raise the stakes even higher. As I mentioned, I've written about this in more depth. I put the link in the chat. I'm very interested to see how the discussion goes from here.
So I want to thank all of our panelists for really informative discussions. And at this point in time, I'm going to start selecting some of the questions from the Q&A that I'll read out. But also if members of the panel have spied questions that they would like to take on directly, we can also do that. I'm going to start one that addresses the US role. So Lourdes asks, I would like to better understand the role of the US in this war. I understand the Budapest Memorandum and US claiming that Ukraine is a democracy, although many will argue it isn't, and that the US, in fact, has taken part in backing up Ukraine's not-so-democratic operations, which can resemble some of Putin's himself. Many of us do recognize the long history of US engaging in warfare. Is there a catch in US supporting this war and possibly sending troops? Do gas lines and gas interests in the US affect this war as it has in, for instance, Iraq and the Middle East? Who'd like to take that one? 'Cause, Go
I
ahead,
suppose
Paul.
I'll offer just a couple of thoughts. One is there is a way in which energy markets are interconnected, but I would strongly urge folks to remember that this is in fact a European conflict in which the United States is, if not peripheral, actually not central to the conflict. And in many cases, it is Russia, Ukraine, and relations with Western Europe that are central. Western Europe for the past 30 or 40 years has maintained an energy dependency upon Russia, one that people of very good will thought would, if anything, tame Russia, because it also implies that Russia's exports and earnings are dependent upon Europe. The principal role that US energy exports have to play right now is to provide an alternative to Russian energy exports, but the volumes just are not commensurate. And slicing Russia's economic energy exports out of all this would lead to a global energy crunch. It would be very difficult to unwind. That's why, even despite the unanimity and extreme moral fervor that we've seen, there's been no appetite so far in Europe to do things like directly end the purchase of oil and gas from Russia, because the cost there would be incredibly high.
And I think I'd just like to add one quick point to that, which is that I would not put it past Russia to turn off the tap, to remind Europe of the dependence that that they do have on Russia. For doing that for a long period of time would be catastrophic for the Russian, oil and gas money that they're reliant on for their budget. But I could certainly see a situation. Russia has not hesitated to use gas in the past, in particular against Ukraine when it felt that it was stepping away from Russia too much. And so I would not be surprised to see that as a possible counter sanction in some way. I'm not sure if you agree with that, Paul, but we've seen that Russia is very willing to shoot itself in the foot in these kinds of ways to make a point. And I think this is the kind of situation where we might see that.
I actually think that's possible. I do think that March is probably a worse time to try to use that weapon than December would have been. But I actually considered mentioning that, and I think it's possible, but also that would deprive the Russian regime of its only source of foreign currency at the moment. So economic interdependence is a very complicated thing, but I do think that is at least something that folks in Europe are thinking about.
I would agree, and yet at the same time, we saw that Germany was willing to suspend certification of Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline that runs under the Baltic. So it contributes to this concept that this really is a complicated issue, because this is going to hurt the revenue stream into Russia, but it's also very damaging to Germany and other states who heavily depend on Russian oil.
Okay, I'm going to take another question from the chat. What are the moral and ethical implications of arming civilians and militias in Ukraine? Can this backfire like the West arming the Mujahideen during the USSR invasion of Afghanistan?
I think these are very different situations, because look at who got armed, who the Mujahideen were, and who was armed, and so on. I found it very interesting to see the kinds of weapons that were being discussed to move to Ukraine, and some of them are very effective and don't require that much training, like the shoulder-mounted surface-to-air missiles or anti-tank weapons. It's just a really different situation, and it would take a very long time to explain that.
Okay. Would anyone else like to address this question?
I can, yeah. I mean, I would just say, yeah, I think it's an important question to keep in mind, but I think, at this point, as kind of we've all been watching, it's really the Ukrainians doing it themselves because of all these complicated issues, right? And so I think if it's the case that they're fighting this bigger battle, but no one else can come help them, I think that's just where we are. And so, I mean, I know a few days ago when, they were going to let prisoners with military experience fight. I mean, there are things that we need to kind of think about, but that's, if they're really going to fight this battle that Europe can't join in, I think that's where we are, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm going to take another question. This one asks, what do you think about the effects of sanctions may have on the attitudes of people in Russia toward their government?
I'd be happy to jump in to address that question. I think it's a really, really important thing to consider, and it's something that I've seen a lot of discussion about, actually. My concern, and this is a concern I've seen circulating in some circles, is that it's gonna hit people. It's obviously going to hit people very hard, and it may not have the desired effect on the Putin administration. And the danger, of course, is that it's going to shore up this sort of narrative, this perception of victimhood and humiliation at the hands of the West. And so there's a very real potential. I mean, I left off contemplating the prospects for protest and successful resistance, and for those gaining traction. This is another variable, the costs of the war, the impact of the war, knowledge about what's taking place in Ukraine, crucial, obviously, as well as the, witnessing body bags, or actually not witnessing body bags, those won't be permitted, but via these attempts to bring this by independent media journalists to make this visible to Russian populations. But the other piece, of course, the sanctions and the impact that that's going to have on people. There is one of the successes, and I see a lot of mention in the chat. People are asking questions about the decade of the 90s, the significance of that, people's experience of economic dislocation in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as well as the sort of shock therapy economic reforms that were introduced in the early part of that decade. That memory has been effectively and powerfully mobilized by the Putin regime, right? It's kind of like an official narrative of humiliation, national humiliation. It works to different extents, it's not uniformly held, but it has been a very conscious and successful strategy, actually, of the Putin administration. And so one danger is that sanctions will play into that, right? Will reinforce that sense that some people hold in Russia, and lead them not to contest the war, but to have a sort of shore up the sense of victimhood.
And go ahead, Audrey.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. The effort to try to support sanctions that separate the people at the top from the rest of the population, as many of you know, was really behind the Magnitsky Act. And from the side of imposing that, it was considered to be pretty successful because it allowed the freezing of assets by some of the more wealthy people and blocking them from sending their kids to Western schools and so on. And by the same token, many of the sanctions that we've seen in the last week have been of the same nature. I saw a story this morning in the Washington Post that Oleg Deripaska, who's one of the top of many oligarchs in Russia, said that this is having a catastrophic effect and a catastrophic effect on the economy as a whole. And so it's possible that the downside is it takes such a long time to have effect, and a lot of people are being hurt and a lot of people are being killed. The hope for the West is that this will eventually squeeze the Russians at the top rather than being able to damage the rest of the population. And again, the interconnectivity makes it very difficult to see where this could all go. But at least there's an effort to try to do those kinds of sanctions without the kind of damage we see so often.
I was essentially going to say mostly that same thing. And I think this, in the West's best case scenario of deploying these kind of sanctions, the idea is to create a split in the elite such that everyone who has been loyal, and even in the face of pretty significant elite sanctions in the wake of the annexation of Crimea, stayed loyal to Putin, that if you turn up the temperature high enough, that you can create some kind of split in the elite such that they would consider removing Putin from power, they would consider ushering him out. I think that is still a pretty significant fantasy that is unlikely to happen, but I do think that the idea is that those sorts of sanctions can move things around in the elite such that they feel like, oh, maybe we have backed the wrong horse this entire time, and it's time to find somebody else who's not going to be as aggressive on the international stage, such that we can preserve our own wealth, which has ballooned, especially for friends of Putin.
I mean, one question I'd be curious to hear from my colleagues who are experts on Russia. I mean, you would imagine that these sanctions will affect everyday Russians as well. I mean, soon, it's going to be a huge economic crisis. Russia relies a lot on imports. People travel, right? This is not the Russian, these days Russians travel. They like to, vacation, have their, tech, their electronic equipment, and some, that soon is going to all change. And so I don't know if how long that is going to take for people to kind of realize that this is, we're going to be isolated. This is going to affect our everyday lives. And so, would be curious if you all think that might also play a part in people coming out to protest or to voice their opposition.
Not to be the one to jump back in here, but I think it's going to really depend on whether they are able to access enough information to be able to connect the one with the other. And so, as the media sources are closing up shop and being forced to close up shop, and the costs of spreading information, there's a law going through the Russian Duma right now that penalizes spreading false information about Russian military, which is vague enough that it could include anything having to do with the war, with punishments up to 12 years in prison. I think it's the key aspect of making that work on the ordinary Russian is that the Russian propaganda about, they're coming after us again, they just want to destroy Russia and we must all stand firm and unite behind the government is not what happens, right? So it has to overcome the information about connecting the activities in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine with what's happening at home, has to overcome the propaganda that's inevitably coming. And I think it's getting increasingly challenging to do that.
All right, I'm going to select another question. This one looks more internally at Ukraine. So to clarify the question on East versus West Ukraine, do the actions of the 2014 revolution and the repression of Eastern Ukrainians thereafter justify Donetsk and Luhansk quest for self-determination? Why does Ukraine want to hold on to regions who wish to secede? Could their independence resolve the central disagreement between those who prefer the Russian bloc and those who prefer the EU?
I feel like I might defer to my colleagues who might know more of the implications of this, but I think this is where it gets complex. I think one thing that's been surprising to many people in the West is who haven't been following, there has been war going on, right, in these places for many years. You go to Kyiv, a few years ago and you wouldn't realize, the country's, there's a war. And I think the question of what was going on in these places, and was it really the citizens of these places, their choices, or was it really, it was Russian aggression previously that led to what was going on? Someone mentioned earlier, there were a lot of IDPs in, Ukraine already, because a lot of people left, those places like Donetsk, Luhansk, they were completely, destroyed, and some people still living there, but they moved to Ukraine. Many moved to Russia. That's the other thing we haven't talked about is over this time period since 2004, a lot of people who, felt like they wanted to be more close, to Russia, they left, right? Or people can, move to the West. And so, I think it's a complicated issue, and obviously it's complicated. This, led to this. I'd be curious to hear what other people have to say on what maybe what should have happened or what should still happen in those places.
All right, if nobody else wants to join in on that one, I'll ask one that looks outside the conflict. How far will the relationship between Putin and Xi go? Will China stand behind Russia throughout the invasion, looking for a long-term partner to have in its tension with the West?
So if it's okay, I'd like to take that one. The relationship between Beijing and Moscow is one that is occupying a lot of folks' attention right now. And all of this is speculation. There's rumors, for instance, that the invasion was timed so as not to take place during the Winter Olympics in Beijing. And certainly they didn't take place despite all the preparations beforehand. But also Beijing has not been giving its full-throated support to Putin at this time. And the relationship between Russia and China is not one of a pair of allies. They are strategic partners. They are very close strategic partners. The relationship has clearly moved a lot closer, but it's not one of full allies. And in any event, allies don't necessarily have to share everything with their allies, with their other partners, if they're undertaking a war of aggression. Remember, even in the 2003 war against Iraq, many US allies strongly condemned the war. And the ways in which Russia has acted to thwart longstanding Chinese objectives, like having sovereignty respected, is certainly something that is of deep concern to Beijing. This is one reason why they did not veto an anti-Russia resolution in the UN Security Council. They instead abstained, which is a powerful statement on its own. But the other flip side of this is that the more Russia is isolated from the West, the more dependent Russia will become on Beijing. And Beijing is a huge growing market for energy outlets. Many pipelines have been constructed to feed the Russian market. The Power of Siberia pipeline is probably the best known, most charismatic of them. And that's going to leave Russia isolated from the West and more willing to support China, even if the reverse is not necessarily true in China's case.
Okay. Let me move on to another question.
Could I just, I'm sorry, could I,
yes,
just to
please.
jump in, this is way beyond my expertise, but I do find it a really interesting question. And I've been, like many of us, I'm sure, I've been attending a lot of these panels, these pop-up panels, and learning a great deal about this. But one of the recent panels I attended, Gulnaz Sharafuddinova, who's a political scientist who's done work on the really interesting work on the political psychology of post-Soviet Russia. She addressed this question of off-ramps that Paul raised here, right, of face-saving ways to present a means of exit before this goes any further. And she was advancing the case that China could play a crucial role here as a negotiating partner, right, that it would be, that could be an extremely useful move for policymakers to take. So that was just an insight I wanted to put in the mix here, because clearly the complexities of this and the question of the extremely volatile geopolitics that we're in, that China could in fact have a beneficial role to play.
All right, I'm going to move on to another question. Could anyone speak to possible dissent from within the Putin administration and by Russian oligarchs? Images on media have shown that infamous meeting between Putin and unhappy bankers. And I'm wondering, if not regime change, are there any openings for administration or leadership changes? And a related question, are there any credible alternatives in Russia right now to Putin? And what would it take to get one?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. So I'll start with the second question, which is, are there any alternatives to Putin? I think one of the most thoughtful in an authoritarian sort of ways that the Russian administration has survived is by making sure that any possible alternative centers of power have not had a chance to survive, and that literally and figuratively. And I think that that's been, so there, you might think about somebody like Alexei Navalny, who got so many people, who was poisoned last year and got so many people out to protest, such that there were, over 10,000 arrests on his return and imprisonment when he came back last year in January. Even Navalny has, like tens of percentage of approval rating in Russia at his height. And so I think the Russian government has been extraordinarily effective at making it very difficult. Even the the Communist Party had a big upswing in seats in the Duma in the last elections. And there was a lot of discussion about how the leader of the Communist Party, or the one who had run in Moscow, the candidate had become too popular and therefore probably wouldn't be allowed to run in the presidential election against Putin in 2024. And so many of the parties that do have seats in the legislature are people who are very compliant with are parties that are very compliant with the Russian government's goals. And so I don't see any alternatives floating around to Putin at this point. And I think that the West is deluding itself if it thinks that if Putin were to leave, that we would get some magical democratic Western-leaning person in his place. I think we would get more of a continuation of the same, perhaps with slightly less erratic international relations behavior.
Would anyone else like to weigh in?
Yeah, just very quickly to underscore what Lauren said. It's not like there's a long list of very plausible people who could replace Putin. Lauren, I'm sure you remember, the other panelists remember what happened to Boris Nemtsov 8 years ago. And he was, in fact, somebody who could have been a plausible next generation successors. One reason why all of the folks that you see in these cabinet meetings and the National Security Council meetings and the meeting with the oligarchs are all of the same generation is that if you're a bright, young, up and coming person, and you could potentially be at all disloyal to Putin, you're not going to find much of a future for yourself in politics in Russia. I mean, that's why Sergei Lavrov has been there forever. I mean, there's other folks in the foreign ministry, but they're not as trusted, they're not as pliable as Lavrov has proven himself to be. And even if we're talking about somebody like Mayor Sobyanin, right? Like the folks who are alternative political players just are not well known, do not have a power base. In the same way that when the August 1991 putsch was carried out, not many folks in the West knew who the KGB head was, who Dmitry Ustinov were. They knew who Gorbachev was. Anybody who could come up would be somebody likely unfamiliar to folks who are not full-time Russia watchers. And it's also unlikely that they'll be markedly different in terms of their support for Russia's political and economic system.
As we're drawing to a close here, I'm going to consolidate into sort of a general question about the concept of a no-fly zone that could be enforced by the United States and NATO. Why or why not is that a bad idea? Is it plausibly going to be taken on? And one of the other questions is, why are so many knowledgeable members of the media actually advocating for this action right now?
A bad idea because it would mean that to enforce the no-fly zone, US or NATO planes would have to enforce it. And that would bring them into confrontation with Russian planes. And that puts everything at a whole new level.
Yeah, I'll just add.
I know, you go.
Okay, no, I was just going to add, I think that Ukrainians are really pushing for this. And I think, people realize that, yeah, exactly as Audrey mentioned, that puts us on a very, quick path to thinking about, nuclear war, which is not where we want to go. But I think, Ukrainians realize it's looking bleak and they need help. And unfortunately, I think what they're thinking, and I think others, maybe, other bordering countries are thinking that maybe Putin won't stop, right, with Ukraine. He might keep going. And so this is the time to do it and to really, despite this possibility. So yeah, it's obviously complex, but I think Ukrainians are going to still push for it.
I think that Ina's right, in the Ukrainians, especially the young Ukrainian journalists who pushed for this in a press conference with Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, make a passionate appeal. And I think that in the West, people have gotten the wrong idea of what war against a great power looks like. No-fly zones are a tool that are easy to impose against powers like Iraq, or in places like certain zones of Syria, because they rely on the West's overwhelming technological dependence and a political willingness to use force to escalate them, as Professor Alstedt said, and to continue to take measures to enforce a no-fly zone that include being willing to kill other countries' combatants. There is no such will when it comes to direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. The Russian Air Force, although it has not covered itself in any great degree of military competence recently, amounts to thousands of airplanes. Russian air defenses, similarly, would take a terrific toll if there were a massive mobilization by the West in order to enforce a no-fly zone. This is just something where the risks of escalation, and let's not be coy, we're talking about a much wider conventional war, or the prospect of at least the demonstrative use of nuclear weapons would be involved as you move up the escalation ladder. And that is, it is very dangerous to move up that ladder any more than we already are, without much greater reasoning to do that.
All right, as we draw to a close, I'm going to ask each of you to answer this question, which is, how do you know what news to trust and what to follow in order to make sense of the war in real time? So if you have some great sources or places that you go for information, let's share it with our audience right now.
I'm happy to start. I've been following two publications that are from the region. The first is the Kiev, and they both have English language sources, which I think is probably important for the majority of our audience. So the Kiev Independent is an independent newspaper that is run in English, and it's working very hard, and they've had really incredible coverage. And the other is Meduza, Meduza, which has an English language website, but is a Russian independent publication in exile in the Baltics. And they have fantastic coverage, both inside and outside of Russia. Those have been my go-to. I like the BBC Russian service also a lot, because you have to speak Russian to be able to read it.
Yeah, I can maybe just follow. Yeah, I would definitely say Kiev Independent is a great source. And, I would say also, go to Twitter. Kiev Independent is tweeting a lot. There's a lot of people who are on the ground. A lot of academics, there's a lot of Ukrainians who went back, a lot of economists I know who are there. Actually, the Kiev School of Economics right now is, was having on Twitter discussions about economic issues in Twitter space. So I think that's a great place to also get a range. I mean, it's hard when you're in an echo chamber, you hear what you want to hear. But I think it's good to kind of get a range. And there are Russians on there who are also, I don't know how much is from Russia now, but I think it's also a place where there's some good discussions going on.
Yeah, I can just jump in to echo what Lauren said about Meduza. That's been my go-to, one of my go-tos. And, obviously with the sort of constraints placed now on social media use and Facebook in Russia, it's changing things. But until fairly recently, I was able to, look at the sort of circulation of discussions by Russian and Ukrainian social scientists, etc. I can also share that there are various institutions in this country that are hosting and kind of curating materials that are terrifically useful that we could share out. The Russian Eurasian Polish Studies program has links to resources as well, the UMass REPS program. In addition, the Davis Center at Harvard, so there are other regional studies institutions that are hosting and holding good sources of English language media coverage and also social science scholarship.
So I had to adjust a little bit for tech reasons, sorry. I agree with what we're all saying, and I would add, if you want, brief English language news/analysis, Eurasianet.org is pretty good. And even RFERL is producing sometimes short, sometimes much longer pieces. And those are useful. Otherwise, I try to triangulate with other things, think tanks that put out reports, Carnegie, Brookings, Chatham House. Those can be, very useful and in-depth analysis.
And Paul, do you have anything that you'd like to recommend?
So I actually basically endorse everything that's just been said. Medusa in particular, I find to be useful, not just about the current conflict, but also about Russian politics more generally. My prognosis, however, is that the quality of information we're going to be dealing with is going to get much worse, especially the quality of information out of Russia itself. There is a full-fledged war and repression of the media, of activists, of folks who have knowledge. It is a chilling effect. And it used to be the case that even several weeks ago, you could depend on at least reporting of factual things. You'd have to read between the lines and so forth, but it's gotten much, much more difficult. And I think that sometimes folks want to have an answer that's going to be very clearly, you go to this site, it's fact-checked, it's whatever. It's much easier to tell what's disinformation. It's much easier to tell what is propaganda. It's much easier to tell what's activism. But telling what's actually going on, there's a reason why the United States spends $80 billion a year on its intelligence community in order to answer just that question. And honestly, if you were just reading the CIA the last couple of months, you had a much better idea of what was going on just because they were saying exactly, apparently, what Russia was thinking. That's an unusual and somewhat paradoxical conclusion to come to. But the real answer is that there's no general answer here. And I really agree with Professor Alstedt that triangulating is important. But my recommendation would be to not rely on any given source, but when you're interested in a given event or fact check, you really have to approach everything almost de novo in order to establish its credibility.
So I want to thank all 5 of our panelists for a great discussion. Thank you so much for the time and energy and effort you've put into preparing and guiding this discussion. This is the first of several